Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is object-oriented programming. Let's look at what objectives you will learn in this lecture. After completing this lecture, you will be able to explain what is OOP, what is the difference between procedural language and an OOP programming style, and how to start thinking in OOPs. This will set you a mindset of how you're going to write your programs using OOP concepts. Okay. So this is what we're going to learn in this lecture. So let's understand what is OOP. The word OOP actually is a full form of object-oriented programming. So when someone say OOP or OOPs, it's not the OOPs, but typically it's OOP, which actually is a full form of object-oriented and programming. So these three words, object-oriented and programming. So object is basically a real-life object. Anything in the world could be an object, right? Computer is an object, car is an object, user is an object. Anything that you can think of as an entity could be an object. So you write your programming style in terms of an object, right? That's basically oriented. The way you write your program in terms of an object is called as object-oriented programming. Instead of writing that program directly, you relate your program to some object first, right? And then you try to define that object using your program. We'll look into details of how we're going to do that, but that's the full form of an OOP. Object-based programming, object-oriented programming. The way you write your program, you think from an object, right? And what is object? Object could be anything that you can think of, right? Everything in the world is an object. Anything that you can define as an object. Your computer object, a car object, phone object, a database could be an object. Anything that you can define into an entity, something that is related to a group. So OOP stands for object-oriented programming. That is a full form, and please remember that. OOP is a programming pattern or a style. So remember this definition. If someone asks you what is OOP, instead of start explaining what is OOP, you can give this one-liner definition. OOP is a programming pattern or a style. OOP is basically a programming pattern or a style you can choose to follow, right? Using which you can create some small group of code based on a real life objects. Like I told you, objects could be like a car, user, bank, cat, dog, anything, right? You have to define an object first, then you have to group your program into that object, and then you start using that in your programming style. Remember that OOP is a programming pattern or a style. And the main purpose of OOP is to create reusable code. You're going to see how OOP will benefit the reusability of the code. But for now, you have to understand the main purpose of OOP is to create reusable code. Well, if someone asks you, why are you writing in OOP? The simple and easiest answer you can give is because of the reusable code. When you try to understand the OOP concept, this is very, very clear to you. The reusability of your code is enhanced just because you follow the OOPs concept. Okay. So remember this, OOP stands for object-oriented programming. So what OOPs bring to your code? What is the benefit of using this programming style or a programming pattern? Well, OOPs bring modularity to your code. When I say modularity, it's basically a components, right? A small components. You create a chunk of code which is related back to some object, and that brings a beautiful modularity to your code. Your code will be split into small modules or small components which can be easily reused in different applications. That's basically the benefit that OOPs bring to your code. And when I say modularity, which actually means you split your program. Let's say you have 1000 lines of program that you typically write. You split your program into smaller individual modules that can be separated and that can be recombined. And how we're going to do it is all about how do you write and understand the OOPs concept. When you write your program using OOPs concept, this is what you're mentally thinking. You're thinking of how do I write my program into simple, smaller individual modules. You write them in a separate individual modules, and then you try to combine them and then work with those components. And when you're writing program using OOP style, then you need to start thinking in modularity or objects. That's what I was trying to explain you. You have to start thinking, how do I create an object, and then how do I write my program to define an object. Okay, so let's move on. Well, this is a very classic example I want to give you. Let's say if you have to write a PHP program to define 3 car types and its color. You have to display a car type and its color. So this is the program that you have to write in PHP, and whatever style that you know till now without oops, you might be defining 3 car variables and then define the car variable colors and then you try to display them, right? And this is how you might be writing your program. On the right hand side you have, let's say, 3 cars, Ferrari, BMW and Hyundai. So on the left hand side you have your PHP program. So in order to write a program to define 3 car types and its color, you will define 3 variables of car type, you will define 3 variables for car color, you will assign the values and then you display them. And this is called as procedural language, wherein you are not thinking of any objects. You're just writing your program with some variables and you're just trying to assign some value to a variable and you're displaying them, right? There's no programming style or there's no programming pattern in this. And this style is called as procedural programming style. Till now, if you have been writing this, then oops is basically will help you to simplify your code, and it will help you to increase the reusability of the code and help you understand how to write a modular coding. Okay, so let's understand that. Well, this is an example of how your code can be converted into an oops programming style. I'm not going details of what is class and all those things, but just try to compare the program that you used to write in procedural, and if you have to write the same program in the oops programming style, you basically create something called as group of reusable code. The group of reusable code, you only define the variable once, the name of the car and the name of the color, and then you try to assign that value and reuse that group of code. You don't reassign to each of the variables, but you create something called as a group of a reusable code. Well, this is the concept of OOP, where you first define an object. So this group of reusable code is called as car, and you're actually imagining a car and then you're trying to assign some details of the car into one group of code, and then we're gonna assign that data to that specific group of code. Okay, we're going to learn all the concepts of the OOP, but try to imagine if you're writing a procedural language, how the OOPs concept will change your programming style. Okay, so let's move on. So what is OOP? Okay, so let's understand the definition of it. OOP stands for object oriented programming. That is the full form of the OOP, and you're thinking in objects. Just now you were in procedural style, you were not thinking of any object, but when it comes to OOPs, you will start thinking about a car object, right? And it is a programming style. How are you going to change your programming style to achieve reusability and modularity in your code? OOPs bring modularity to your code, means you try to group your code and try to reuse it. And you think and convert your code into real life objects and use it. That's how the OOPs concepts work. You don't start writing your program, you take a step back and you think first, how do I convert my code into a real life object and then try to reuse it? Okay, we'll look into some of the examples so that it's very clear of what is OOPs and what is the benefit that OOPs bring to your programming style. Well, here's a comparison between procedural versus OOPs. On the left hand side, I have the procedural coding, wherein you define the variables, you assign the value, you print them. There's no concept behind it. There's no object behind it. You don't know if I give the variable name as $A, $B, $C, and you don't even know what it is all about, right? You haven't defined any concept, or there's no programming style in this procedural language. You're just thinking about a variable, where to save my data and how do I display them. Wherein in the OOPs, basically you are defining something called as a class, right? You're defining a cars class. Then you're thinking of, okay, I am dealing with cars now, so I have to convert my code into something called as cars, and then I try to reuse them, right? And if you just glance through the code here, you have a cars class. We haven't discussed about what is class, but think about an object, right? Car is an object which has a name and a color, and then you're just trying to define it once, and then you're trying to reuse them by just passing the data into it, and then you're trying to print them. Forget about what is the notation, what is this all about, but think from a difference between procedural versus OOP. How you are changing your coding style from writing just variables and assigning values, than creating something called as an object and then try to reuse that object in a different manner by passing different values to it. Okay, so what is the difference between procedural versus OOP? In procedural, you are actually thinking in how to write the code from top to bottom by defining the variable and print them. Well, this is what we think in procedural. If you're writing procedural for years, this is what you and me has been doing, right? We start from top of the page, we go to bottom of the page, and whenever we are hit with a variable, we define them, we store the value, we move on. We want an array, we define an array, we store the value, we move on. If you want to print something, we write echo statements, we move on. We are not thinking about a pattern. We are not thinking about how can I organize them. If you organize them into smaller components, then you can reuse them. But in procedural, it's not like that. You just keep writing the code from top to bottom. But in OOP, you are thinking in how to define into reusable components first. You have to define first what components you need in a program, and then you use it. So that's basically a bottom-up approach. You don't first write your program. You conceptually define it first into a component, then you try to reuse them. Okay? In procedural, you define variables, you define functions, you define logical flow of the program, and there's a sequential flow from top to bottom. You start from the top, you finish up in the bottom, right? That's the procedural style you and me has been following from years. From now onwards, when we are learning about OOPs, we are actually thinking of a component. We are not writing a program, we are not writing variables, we are not writing functions. We are not thinking about logical flow of the program from start to bottom. We are thinking of a component. We are converting a program into something called as an object. And we are converting and we're thinking what is this object could be related to. That's the thinking of a component, and then we define that component. Then we'll define if that is a component, it could be a car, cat, dog, database, file operations, string operations, it could be an API, whatever it is, but what this object variables and functions could be in that component, right? If it's a database, then definitely the variable inside a database could be database connection. If it is a file, then it's a handler of a file, right? If it's a phone, then it's a phone name, phone color, phone price. That could be the variables. Then the functions is send message, make a call. It could be functions that operate on that component. Okay, you have to start thinking in object oriented programming from here onwards. And then in the last, once you define that component, the major benefit that you're gonna get is you can reuse it. Then each component can share its benefit by extending it, and then you can share the reusability function from each other. Okay, so that's the benefit between procedural versus OOP. So let's start thinking in objects. I want you to have a very clear mindset before starting this course that you have to start thinking in objects. Forget your procedural style that you have been thinking so long. Stop thinking about how do I define variables, what should my variable name, what are my methods, and how should I put my sequential flow. Shall I put this in this file or should I put in that file? That is basically thinking in procedural. I want you to make a paradigm shift in how you think about your program. You have to start thinking in objects, right? When I say objects, it could be a car object, it could be a phone object, it could be a video object, could be a database, could be a file and folders, could be a user, could be mail, and could be download option. So you have to think about when you write a program, what are you trying to write about? What are you trying to define that feature? Maybe you're trying to define a feature of a video, right? You're writing a video player. Then you have to think that you're writing a video object. If you're connecting a database, it's a database object. If you're writing a mail, then that is basically a mail object. If you're downloading something, then that downloading is a feature and you're writing a download object, right? Start thinking in objects. That's the mindset you should have when you learn OOPs. Because once you know, okay, I have to write in object, then all the concepts of OOP will help you to define that object and help you to write better object-oriented programming, and help you also to understand how can you convert your procedural language into the object-oriented programming language. Okay, so start thinking in objects, and I want you to give this a serious thought of how do I start thinking in OOP. Don't just skip it over and say, okay, let's look at what are the OOPs concepts first. If you really want to learn OOPs and change your concept, thinking in OOPs is really must and very important to know. First thing you need to understand is everything in the world can be defined as an object. Don't come to a conclusion that, oh, this cannot be an object, so we cannot write OOPs in for this particular feature. Everything in the world can be defined as an object. Start thinking and organize your code into smaller components and real life objects. This is the step 1 before you actually open up the editor and start typing. You have to take a step back in OOPs and you have to sit down and say, okay, let me organize my code logically. How do I write into components and how do I define them into a real life objects? We will start learning OOPs concept and how to write OOP in the upcoming sections. Right, that's a bunch of concepts available to understand it, but you have to start thinking in OOPs. That's the main concept I want you to understand. Okay, and first thing from here onwards I want you to do is stop thinking in procedures, variables and functions. Stop thinking in variables and functions. Even we will not call it as a variable here onwards. Even when you define a variable, that word variable, we will not use it. When you define a function, we will not call it as a function. That's because the naming convention in the OOPs for variable and functions are different. In OOPs, variables are called as properties and functions are called as methods. So we will completely change our lingo in how do we talk in OOPs, and how also we will start thinking in OOPs, right? Start thinking in objects. Okay, so I hope it's very clear what the mindset should be and what is OOP. OOP stands for object oriented programming and it's basically a programming style. And what is the purpose? It brings reusability and modularity to your code. You start defining into small components so that you can reuse them and you can extend the feature of that component by other components. Also, you have to do a mindset shift from procedural language to an object oriented language, wherein you have to understand what benefits you're gonna get in moving away from procedural and moving to an object-oriented programming. Well, that's all about what is OOP, and I hope you get a pretty much idea of what is OOP and how you're gonna start organizing your code into an object. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of what you should be able to understand by now. You should be able to explain what is object-oriented programming in your own words. You should be able to understand what is the difference between a procedural language and an OOP programming style. And I want you to start thinking in OOPs. Okay, from now onwards, if you see something, a program or something, try to convert that into an object and see what is this object and what features of that program can be moved into an object. You might not have learned how to define it, but you can start thinking in OOP. Okay, so that's all this lecture on what is OOP. Let's try to implement some of the concepts that we have seen here. Let's try to understand and start writing in OOPs. Okay, that's all for this in this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.